Hi there, it's Llarold, and this is my in-depth Brewmaster Monk guide for Season 3 of Mythic Plus in Shadowlands. This raid tier took a really long time, but now that Mythic Jailer is finally dead, I have the chance to get into a topic that's really caught my interest in this patch in a way that it never has before. And I'm talking about Mythic Plus dungeons. I have to say, this is the most fun I've ever had doing dungeons on any level in all the 17 or 18 years I've been playing WoW. I've climbed to 3k on the Monk and the Pally in the last month, and now that Prog is finally over, I'm looking forward to climbing to 3k on the other 4 tanks as well. I did play with a dedicated healer for the most part, the other half of the WoW at Night team. For some of our runs we had 1 or 2 guildies as DPS, but for the most part we were pugging all 3 of our DPS the whole way, and it was all relatively pain-free. As much as people like to complain about pugging on Reddit and on Twitter, I really didn't find it to be a problem. I think you just have to come into it with a mindset of, especially as the tank, your job is to kind of control the routes and what's going on in the dungeons, and so you want to just make everything as easy as it possibly can be for people who, frankly, aren't going to be coordinated. You know, that was my expectation. Didn't want to get anybody in a voice, didn't want to force anybody to have to talk to each other. Just, you know, a little bit of chat here and there saying things like, I kick X first. That's about the level of coordination that we hit as like the upper limits. Now, obviously 3k isn't some enormous unattainable accomplishment either. I mean, Andy and Now are already timing Necrotic Wake 30s, but I think that's kind of exactly what I'm getting at here. I genuinely think that anyone who does their weekly 15s and 16s and feels comfortable with that can reasonably push into doing keys in the 20 to 22 range. And I think a bit of guidance and motivation while we're at it from someone who's already made that push might just be exactly what you need. So on that note, I'm going to cover all the usual stuff like I do in a class guide. I'll focus specifically on Mythic Plus for stuff like talents, gearing, and so on. Although, since this is about monks, not much changes between Mythic Plus and Raid. Let's go ahead and get right into that usual stuff. And you do the usual thing of commenting and liking and subscribing and blah blah blah. So I'll start by just talking about how Monk plays in Mythic Plus and what's good and bad about it. First off, it's extremely tanky, like extremely tanky, thanks to the awesome tier set 4-piece bonus. I would say that getting that 4-piece really is your highest priority when it comes to honestly playing any tank at all in this patch. I found that doing 15s and 16s and so on, even at the very start of the patch, like day 1 without any tier at all or double legendary, wasn't really that bad, but stuff did hit hard on fortified weeks. As soon as I picked up 4-piece on each of the tanks, except for Demon Hunter, because I haven't yet, I was absolutely breezing through everything. It does create a need to chain pull as a Brewmaster Monk, which isn't really a problem, but I think basically because the Keg Smash extra health buff lasts 10 seconds, you want to cast Keg Smash at least every 10 seconds for the entirety of the dungeon, from the start all the way to the end. So for some of the spots where you can't, like flying between platforms and Spires of Ascension or leaving a wing of Theater of Pain or something, the start of the first pull where you don't have the Keg Smash buff at all can be a little tough. In terms of the bad, the only real limitation that Monk has is that it can be forced to kite. Now, I really found that to be mostly limited to fortified weeks or really huge pulls on tyrannical weeks, or anytime there's necrotic. At least going up into the 22 range, I found that to be the case. I think if I were pushing above 25, I think that would be the case pretty much every key. And, you know, whatever. In my case, I never really felt like I was really ever getting hit super hard. I think in general, when I do have to kite, it's little brief moments of, here's a double pull on a Raging Week that is about to hit low health. My health is around 50%. Celestial Brew isn't quite up yet. I'll kite for a couple of seconds, maybe use a stun or Ring of Peace just to buy, you know, 2 or 3 seconds of safety, and then Keg Smash or Expel Harm or Celestial Brew or whatever, and then I'm good. Back into melee range, everything's back to normal. In terms of damage output, Monk is very solid in Mythic Plus. It's not as good as Blood DK was prior to being nerfed, but nothing was. Monk is, more than Blood DK, it's very forgiving and it's very consistent. And that's unlike both DK and Druid. It's not reliant on cooldowns for solid damage output. It has solid damage cooldowns as Kyrian with Weapons of Order, but Monk is just super consistent, great at threat on pulls, regardless of whether you have cooldowns or not. Easy for opening threat as well. You basically press Keg Smash, maybe twice, some spinning crane kick, should be good. That's good. And it makes it easy for players to learn on as well, if you're maybe a little less comfortable with picking up AoE threat on some of the more complex tanks like DK. Now, Monk doesn't have the same potential defensive scaling that DK does, so for pushing up into the 30 range, it's definitely not the strongest class right now, but for pushing into the low to mid 20s, I absolutely think Monk is totally competitive with every other tank. It's easy to play, it's versatile, and pretty fun. So let's get into Covenant selection. The best Covenant for Brewmaster Monk in Mythic Plus is still Kyrian. It adds the most damage output, it is the best for on-pull threat, and generally speaking, it's just the most popular Covenant at all levels in all content. That being said, Necrolord has defensively been very solid in Mythic Plus. I would say I only play Necrolord in Theater of Pain or Plaguefall when I have to fill the Necrolord role, and in those situations, it's very good, but it is generally a weaker choice than Kyrian, which is more straightforward and more offensive. I think the only spot in this patch where I really needed the specific defensive boost that I got from playing Necrolord was on Mythic Rygalon, which was obviously a raid fight, not Mythic Plus related at all. Instead, in Mythic Plus, if I really needed extra tankiness, like I felt like I was just getting obliterated, I prefer Night Fae. It's a bit harder to play than Necrolord. It's certainly not as popular as Kyrian or Necrolord, but in terms of tankiness, it is beyond comparison. I think Night Fae Monk, when it's played well, is probably the tankiest tank in the entire game, including Blood DK, including like Necrolord Prot Warrior. I think it is incredibly slept on by the community. It is so unkillable. The problem is that it gives up a lot of burst damage by not being Kyrian, which means it's just not as useful for super high-end pushing, because they really need that damage from everyone in the group. It's not great for MDI speed clears for the same reason, and because it's a little inconsistent, for just trying to push your way to timing everything on a 20 or better, it's not as easy to play as Kyrian or Necro. I do play it for Mists and the other side if there's no other Night Fae. That's pretty rare though, it's really easy to find Night Fae in this game. Clicking the jars in the other side as the tank is really not ideal anyways, but you can do it if you have to. Usually I'll try to pop a cooldown or, like Celestial Brew or use a leg sweep or something like that before I start casting the jar opening cast. It lasts a couple of seconds. In terms of the positives of playing a Night Fae Monk, I think the threat generation on pulls is very, very solid. Arguably like right on the level of Kyrian or probably better. I think I have had fewer problems with threat on pull as Night Fae than I ever did as Kyrian. Basically none at all ever. And that is really nice. Also, I Touch of Death the final boss in a Halls like 21 or something for almost 300k. It was like 288,000 damage with a Touch of Death. And that was pretty cool. And I got over 430,000 health on the first boss in a Miss of Tyrannus Seath, although I lost the footage from that run, so you'll just have to take my word on it. The health scaling from Naya is absolutely buck wild. As for Vinthier, I did actually play it for some of our Sanguine Depths and Halls of Atonement runs. I wouldn't really recommend it. That was just me flexing. It's honestly not bad, and I think the Vinthier Monk Legendary playstyle of trying to fit in as many crits as you can in the 24 seconds that Fallen Order is active is super duper fun in Mythic Plus. You can get like 45-second cooldowns on Fallen Order, which is hilarious, but it's not actually good. Now let's move on to Soulbinds, and I do have a pretty major change from the prior video I did in the patch 9.2 preview, and that is I think that no matter what tree you're using, you should be going for 3 potency conduits, 2 endurance conduits, and 1 finesse conduit as a Brewmaster Monk wearing the 4-piece tier set bonus. The only thing you should ever swap out between Mythic Plus and Raid, if you even remember to do it, I think I literally just ran 4 dungeons today and forgot to do it, is the finesse conduit. I'll go into more detail on that in the next section, but anyways, yeah. Like I said, I never remembered to swap out Dizzying Tumble for Mythic Plus. Always forgot. Now let's just go Covenant by Covenant. As Kyrian, you use Mechanicos. You spec him like this. He is by far the best Soulbind for Kyrians. It's never close. Pelagos is terrible. Not a bad Covenant or Soulbind overall, but I hate Pelagos because he's the one guy who I very glaringly will realize in the middle of a run that I've just swapped to Kyrian for and forgotten to change, and I'm getting these stupid mastery orbs instead of the incredible power of Mechanicos, and he's especially annoying, unlike all the others who, whatever. As Necrolord, I think Marilith is a stronger choice than Imini. You get more personal damage value out of Marilith, and if you remember to use your Fleshcraft often enough to get all the extra stat buffs from nearby corpses, this Soulbind will add a ton of value. Way more than you would get from Imini or Hermir. As Night Fae, the Naya Soulbind is what makes this Covenant tanky. Her top of the tree trait, Grove Invigoration, grants you 1% health and 25 mastery for every stack. You generate 4 stacks every time you cast Feline Stomp, and with an extra 2 procs per minute on top of that. Stacks last 30 seconds but don't refresh, so they stack up and fall on top of, fall off of each other. Kind of like Iron Fur for Bear Druid, if you're familiar with that. Depending on your RNG, you can maintain literally anywhere from 10 to 20 stacks while tanking, so we're talking about like 10 to 30% more extra health because of the bottom tree trait that buffs the value of all of them by 50% for a few seconds after you generate a stack. Obviously, that's an enormous health bonus. I mean, an extra 30% that stacks with the bonus that you're getting from your 4-piece. Crazy. The free 250 to 500 plus mastery is also really good for reducing your damage taken from auto attacks. You will absolutely notice the difference that Naya makes if you choose to play Night Fae. Ultimately, the big problem is just, all that extra tankiness doesn't really translate into the dungeons being better. It doesn't translate into me doing more damage and making the runs easier for everybody else. And finally, just for the sake of being complete, General Draven is the best Soulbind for Vinthier. I played around with Theotar in order to try to maximize damage, and that's trolling. If you want to maximize your damage, you play Kyrian, period. If you need to play Vinthier to fill for Hulls or Sanguine Depths, or you just want to screw around, Draven is the right choice. He's super tanky, and the free stat budget he provides is nice, but also, unlike Theotar, it's consistent, which is good. All right, now let's move on to conduits. I'll cover the ones I think you should use in every single Soulbind setup. The 3 good potency conduits for Brewmaster Monk are Walk with the Ox, that's your number 1, your Covenant conduit, no matter what Covenant you're playing, that's your number 2, and Scalding Brew. I guess that's your number 3. Honestly, the difference between the Covenant conduits and Scalding Brew is really minor, and if you're trying to figure out which one to put second or third because you're not quite 80 renown yet, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. Walk with the Ox is very good. It really buffs your Nuzao and cuts his cooldown by a lot. The cooldown reduction procs from every tick of Spinning Crane Kick, so using Spinning Crane Kick, even in single target instead of Tiger Palm, is a DPS increase if you're able to get more Nuzao casts off. That's important. If you've just cast Nuzao and you're like on the final boss of a dungeon and you're hitting Spinning Crane Kick over and over again, unless you're going to be there for 2 minutes for you to get another cast off, that's actually just a DPS loss compared to hitting Tiger Palm. The Covenant conduits are all simple, but they're all generally pretty good. The Kyrian one actually is a little weaker than Scalding Brew. I think that's the only one that is like kind of a standout mediocre option, but it's still pretty decent. Scalding Brew has been buffed by the tier set 4-piece bonus, and it's now a really nice boost in power, enough that you should always run it, even in the case of talent or conduit, whatever they're called, Soulbind trees that used to have a good enough passive to justify only running 2 potency conduits, like Mechanicos as a good example. Scalding Brew with the tier set bonus interaction, very good, worth taking always. Endurance conduits are also pretty simple. You have 2 decent options, the rest of them, all pretty minor, not worth using. Harm Denial is number 1, it grants you extra self-healing with Expel Harm, it's a 5-second cooldown. It doesn't affect the healing you get from your Gift of the Ox Orbs consumed with the Expel Harm, so it's not insane, but it's still the best, most consistent self-healing increase available. I highly recommend it. Condensed Animosphere is the other good power. It just adds a steady trickle of healing every 10 seconds, and that's good. Finally, Finesse Conduits. Dizzying Tumble grants a minor damage reduction effect after your leg sweep fades from enemies. It's a small bonus, but it actually has defensive value, and that's terrific from a Finesse Conduit. Like I said before, I usually would just forget to swap this out. It's not the end of the world, but if you're looking to pick up every advantage you can, why not take this too? Okay, next up is Legendaries, and this is going to be less about legendary powers because there's only 2 worth wearing as a Brewmaster Monk, and more about where you put them on your gear. But just to quickly cover legendary powers, you wear Storm Stout's Last Keg and Unity. If you wear anything else, you're making a mistake. I think that's the only time I'll be this definitive, hard and fast about something in this video, but that's it. Those are the options. Now, in terms of what slots to craft those in, that can be dictated a bit by the rest of your gear. In terms of your tier set, shoulders, chest, and legs are all crit verse, which is great. The helm is crit mastery, which is fine, and the gloves are haste mastery, which is also just fine. Storm Stout's Last Keg can go in shoulders, gloves, or belt. The advantage of running Storm Stouts and gloves is that it replaces your worst itemized set of tier, piece of tier, which is good, but running Storm Stouts in your belt will guarantee you a socket. I would say, if you have a well-itemized belt and you have the other 4 pieces of tier, crafting Storm Stouts in your gloves is ideal. If both of those things aren't true, then I would run it in the belt slot. Unity is special in that it can fit into any slot. Legendaries that are in the helm, neck, bracers, belt, or ring slots get free sockets. Because of that, I chose to craft Unity as a ring on all my characters because rings are a slot with a low chance of collision with other gear. I would say that's a decent, but not perfect slot to run Unity in for any character. Yeah. Putting Unity in the helm and running tier gloves is the move I'm going with currently. You get a ton of stat budget out of a legendary helm, the free socket is great, and that is about it. In general about gear and legendary recrafting, I would say this: don't worry about it too much. The main rule for gear is pretty simple. Get the 4-piece bonus, get your 2 legendaries, then maximize your item level. Get good trinkets, get good weapons, and then worry about stuff like optimizing the secondary stat priority on your gear, getting as much versatility as you can, adding gem sockets, that kind of thing. Now let's move on to talents. Here is the default talent setup. You're going to want to use this about 95% of the time. The primary talent swap I would recommend is that if you play Night Fae, you should run Chi Burst instead of Chi Wave. For some reason, every enemy and ally you hit with Chi Burst counts as a separate spell cast for the purposes of resetting Phaline Stomp. So, quick Chi Burst while standing on a Phaline is virtually always a guaranteed reset. Basically, an opener as Night Fae will look like Keg Smash, Phaline Stomp, Chi Burst, Phaline Stomp, Keg Smash. Something like that. Enormous amount of opening threat in AoE. Or single target for that matter. Other than that, I recommend running Chi Wave at all times. It deals more damage and healing than Eye of the Tiger. It's useful for tapping enemies who are at range, or for killing explosives that are out of melee range, which is a pretty annoying thing to have to deal with on most tanks, certainly on Monk. You could use Eye of the Tiger if you like, but I think it's a weaker skill, and it is a less popular talent for that reason. In raids, I usually say that Chi Torpedo is a decent option, but for Mythic Plus, I would always use Tiger's Lust, being able to clear roots is just really good. The control it gives you while doing little bits of kiting is really good. It's just much better than Chi Torpedo. And the fact that you can use it to clear roots on other people if you're really comfortable with that level of party management is amazing. Bob and Weave is better than Damp and Harm in Mythic Plus because it's just a lot more reliable. You should basically always be using Bob and Weave. If you forget, it's not the end of the world, but I always recommend it over Dampen. And now we get to the one tier where there is actually a good player preference choice. Special Delivery or Rushing Jadewind. Both are good talents. Special Delivery is a slightly higher DPS choice than Rushing Jadewind in dungeons. The long, powerful slow is really helpful for kiting as well. I've played both quite a bit, and I still prefer Rushing Jadewind. It's just more comfortable for me, and it helps with generating a little bit of threat on pulls. Since it's a skill you can precast and get some free damage as you start a pull, but the difference there is pretty minor. Again, it's a total preference thing. Both options are absolutely fine. In terms of what's more popular in Mythic Plus, Rushing Jadewind is slightly more popular overall, but Special Delivery is technically a little bit better. The difference is really small enough that I think you're better off just playing what you like here, and I think that you should try out both and figure out which you like more through experience. And that's it. Now let's talk about rotation, and this is going to be a bit of a different section from the way I usually do it in my guides. Those are usually focused more on how to do the max DPS rotation in raids, how to use cooldowns, and while that is still important, the most important part of playing well in Mythic Plus is basically consistently holding threat, staying alive, doing pulls correctly, and then kind of guiding your party through the dungeons. So that's what I want to emphasize. Fortunately, monks have a really strong and easy toolkit for generating threat on the pull, and I'm going to walk through how I handle pretty much every single pull in a Mythic dungeon now and show off a couple of examples just in Mythic 0 dungeons on my own first, just kind of talking about how I think while I'm handling pulls, and then I'll play some clips of me actually doing the starts of pulls in some dungeons and talk over those as well.
All right, and so I'm gonna demonstrate how I would normally do the first pull of Necrotic Wake, or really just about any pull in any dungeon, by just simply doing the first pull of Necrotic Wake. So normally the way I would start out this is, there'd be the golden banner here, I would target the Corpse Harvester and focus it before the wall even went down. Then run in, Rushing Jadewind up, hit him with a Keg Smash, hit that set with a Keg Smash, bring those over with some sort of threat generating ability, Spinning Crane Kick, Keg Smash again, Breath of Fire, and now finally Weapons of Order, a couple of Keg Smashes. And then there we go. Alright, and just to kind of show off another comparison and use an example that doesn't have 3 pulls in one, I'm going to do the first pull of Plaguefall as well. And some people like to skip. I like to literally just start Plaguefall off by just pressing W and walking right up and in. I focus that Flesh Giant, the Decaying Flesh Giant over there. Now, of course, usually in Mythic Plus, you have the 10-second, wait, so he's a little further along. He's about there. I focus him because he has, like, a fairly important attack, but I just walk over to this pack, hit him with a Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, another Keg Smash. Once that Giant has cleared the other pack, I'll taunt him in, hit him with a little bit of damage. Focus interrupt his first cast, and then again, once everything's sort of secured, Weapons of Order, hit him with a couple Keg Smashes, really just go to town.
Generally speaking, the way you want to start off a pull is with Keg Smash. I like Rushing Jadewind because if Keg Smash missed anything, I'll still get a little tap of threat just by walking into melee range of an enemy, since I always precast it before pulling. But if I am using Special Delivery, I will make absolutely certain to cast a Spinning Crane Kick sometime shortly after using that opening Keg Smash, just to be absolutely sure that I have tagged everything and I have threat on everything. It's all locked up. It's in jail with me. And I would say in general, spinning crane kick is a really good skill to use in situations where you're moving and trying to pick up threat, or you're trying to get threat on an enemy that's not attackable yet, but it's still doing some kind of RP. The first boss in Streets, Tazavesh, is a good example. He walks out, stands around for a moment, and then becomes attackable. On a tank like a Death Knight or a Paladin, you could put down Death and Decay or Consecration, but Monk doesn't have those, so I like to spinning crane kick about a second or so before I know the boss will be attackable. Getting the first hit on enemies is one of the absolute most important things you can do to ensure you have threat. And spinning crane kick hits multiple times a second, so it's a really good ability for getting that initial tap of threat on pulls. Now, because we're using the Conduit Scalding Brew, the goal is to get Breath of Fire up before hitting the majority of our Keg Smashes. You can't do it with all of them, obviously. The very first Keg Smash has to be applied before you can even apply Breath of Fire. And maintaining the 4-piece bonus is more important than anything else for your defenses, so you never want to hold Keg Smash long enough that you lose the 4-piece bonus, but on the opener, my goal is to Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Keg Smash again. I want to try, to get that combo rolling as quickly as I can. I may have to use Keg Smash a couple of times right off the bat if I have a DPS who's blowing cooldowns and I'm worried about losing threat, or if a pack is really spread out, like say it's the start of Necrotic Wake where it's actually a couple of pulls at once. I'll Keg Smash one, walk over to another, Keg Smash that, bring another in and try to hit them with spinning crane kick as they're walking into melee range. But ultimately the goal is to get everything gathered into one place, hit it with, the Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Weapons of Order, and then unload the full normal rotational combo into them. Now, obviously, if you're not playing Kyrian, that will affect your opener. And I think that is the primary thing that monks playing Necrolord who struggle with initial threat do wrong. Bone Dust Brew on its own doesn't generate threat. It doesn't do damage. Because it's a good skill and you don't want to waste any of the cooldown of it, players will try to use it too early on in a pull, usually like as the first skill or maybe the second ability they use in a pull. And that can cause mobs to lose threat, run around, and start smashing your group. So whether you're playing Kyrian, Necrolord, or even Vinthyr, you want to focus on using Keg Smash, Spinning Crane Kick, and Breath of Fire to grab that initial threat on a pull, get the enemies gathered together, and then use your Covenant abilities and go into your normal rotation. Night Fae is the one exception here because Feline Stomp is a really good AoE threat tool that you should absolutely use on pull. My move, I think I said it already, but just to reiterate, is to open with a Keg Smash as I'm walking into melee range, then immediately Feline Stomp, Chi Burst, and Feline Stomp again. At that point, I'll go into the normal rotation, and it's almost impossible to lose threat once you've hit a pack with that whole Night Fae combo. Once you have threat under control, you'll go into the normal rotation, which looks like this most of the time. In general, when you're playing Night Fae, you want to hold Chi Burst until Feline Stomp comes up so that you can use it to trigger a quick reset immediately after casting Feline Stomp. So basically, my goal whenever using Chi Burst is always for it to be Feline Stomp, Chi Burst, Feline Stomp, like that. It's just a really nice combo. Sometimes I will hold Chi Burst just to guarantee a reset if I know I'm going to have to move soon but not yet, such as when I'm fighting a boss who fills an area up with pools on the ground but doesn't like to move around a lot. Top of my head, the first boss in Mists of Tir Naseeth is definitely a good example there. In terms of managing offensive cooldowns, for the most part, I just use Covenant abilities on cooldown as much as I can. The main place where I would hold them during a pull is if it's almost over as they're coming up. Weapons of Order has a pretty long ramp-up time, about 20 seconds, and it lasts a really long time from start until the final debuff expiration, about 45 seconds. So it is a skill you really want to use on pulls that are going to last for a good while. You always want to make sure that you never overlap the Nizal from the Kyrian Legendary with your normal regular Nizal, as they will consume each other's stomp bonus from your Purifying Brew casts. I don't really do much in the way of taking extra damage to get even more damage out of Nizal's stomps in Mythic Plus. it makes sense as a good damage increase, sitting down or turning your back, and it is something that I absolutely did in Raid on the Jailer. But in Mythic Plus, I think it's a little too risky. But he is a good offensive cooldown, even if you're just playing the game the normal intended way of trying to be as tanky as you normally can, at least on fortified weeks. Basically, when Nizao is active, you just want to try to purify as big of staggers as you can, and that's about it. In terms of using Purifying Brew and Celestial Brew, I generally try to use both of those abilities once I've taken some damage and I'm a good bit below full health. With Celestial Brew, since it is such a big shield, I really like to be able to heal myself with Expel Harm during the time it's up and actually get some health back instead of just wasting it on overhealing because I'm, hit the shield while I'm at full health. With Purifying Brew, I generally want to keep one charge on cooldown at the very least, but otherwise I'm trying to wait a little bit until chugging that second charge. I'm trying to take like a nice sized hit first. The same goes for Expel Harm. It's a great healing skill. Obviously, it's something you want to hit very often, but you kind of want to treat it like Death Strike. You don't want to be like, oh, I just dropped a 97% health, but it's off cooldown, gotta hit it. You want to wait until something has actually knocked your health down a little bit, Expel Harm as quickly as you can to get it back, and then sort of repeat. Hitting it when it's just going to overheal just basically wastes your energy, and more importantly, it puts it on cooldown. And you don't want to be in a situation where in the next 5 seconds, you've gone from full health to half or whatever, and you weren't able to use it to get back up. And so now you're putting yourself behind by having wasted it before. Now, Fortifying Brew is your primary defensive cooldown, and I generally will try to plan the pulls where I intend to use that a little bit ahead of time. I usually want it to be in spots where I know I won't have it overlapping with other good cooldowns, including like group offensive cooldowns. So for example, in Necrotic Wake, I have a major offensive cooldown, actually both of them, running during that opening pull. So even though it's a big pull, 3 packs at once, I don't really ever feel like I'm in danger there. Even on really nasty fortified affix combos, it's fine. The second pull over on the right is also fairly large, and I think it has 2 caster mobs and like 5 or 6 mobs plus the Season 3 relics. Everyone's cooldowns are down, and that can make it actually last pretty long and be pretty sketchy. It's a really tough pull to kite, even a little bit, because of the casters, the unsoulable big guy, and the little guys who jump around a lot. So I like to be ready to use Fortifying Brew and potentially one or even both of my defensive trinkets the moment I feel like I'm starting to take a good bit of damage on that pull. Now, obviously, you don't want to overlap Fortifying Brew and your trinkets at the same time. Generally, you want to kind of layer them one after the other. Usually, I mean, if I've hit Fortifying Brew and I'm still below 30% health, it's not a bad idea to hit Bullet Spattered Scale rather than just die. So yeah, that's it. Fortifying Brew, it's really good, for difficult pulls where you won't have Weapons of Order or Nuzao good to go, but especially for spots where you can't kite, you're going to be dealing with a lot of caster damage, it's not going to get interrupted or whatever. That's where it's really nice to have. And now let's briefly talk about kiting. Monks have a really good toolkit for kiting. Roll, Clash, Tiger's Lust, Transcendence, Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, Keg Smash, Special Delivery. It's a lot. It's extremely easy to kite as a monk, and it's really forgiving because you can still deal damage with Keg Smash and Breath of Fire from outside of melee range. You can refresh Rushing Jade Wind or cast Expel Harm or Spinning Crane Kick. You can technically roll away and use Vivify if you desperately need to self-heal, although I almost never find myself in that situation anymore thanks to the 4-piece bonus. Usually, kiting on a monk now takes the form of stepping out of melee range for a couple of seconds when my health is super duper low, hitting one of Keg Smash or Celestial Brew or Expel Harm, and then moving right back into melee range and continuing to fight. Now let's talk about stats and gear. Versatility is the most important stat. It's the best offensive and defensive stat for monks. You should gem and enchant versatility. Crit is the second best stat for damage, and the second best overall because it increases your healing taken. Mastery is a good defensive stat against auto attack damage, but it doesn't function against spells, dots, special attacks, or environmental effects like sanguine or necrotic or whatever, just autos, so it's a little inconsistent. And both Kyrian and Night Fae monks get a decent chunk of mastery from their covenants, so it gets diminishing returns there as well. The most important thing to strive for with gearing is 4-piece tier bonus and legendaries. That takes top priority. After that, it's just about item level. Aside from trinkets, basically trinkets, some maybe weapons, item level is almost always more important than itemization. The one little bit about weapons I would say is that dual wielding is almost always worth doing. Almost always. You really only need one good one-hander for dual wielding to be better than using a two-hander. I would say it's worth simming yourself. You can go to raidbots.com. I recommend it. But yeah, even a 13 item level drop, going from a heroic pair of one-handers or heroic main hand and lower than that offhand will generally still sim ahead of a mythic two-hander. Now let's talk about enchants, and I'll just go slot by slot. Celestial Guidance is a very good enchant for your weapon. It provides a solid mix of offensive and defensive value, and because it's a personal buff, it's pretty consistently good. It's hard to get unlucky procs of Celestial Guidance. You should have it on one of your weapons guaranteed. I did finally make that swap after having been a double Lightless Force guy for the whole expansion, just lazily doing 16s and 17s and stuff. And it was the right call. You can use Lightless Force on the other hand to maximize your DPS, in Trash and Mythic Plus, and this is generally what I would recommend. Celestial Guidance on one hand, Lightless Force on the other. Sinful Revelation is a decent option for tyrannical weeks. It can add a little more single target DPS than Lightless Force, but it can also proc on little ads or explosives or enemies who are about to die in trash pulls, which is annoying, and it is single target only, which is generally just not as good in Mythic Plus. In terms of your other enchants, going with the chest, you just want to run 30 stats to chest. That'll be 30 agility. That's great. That is better than 20 agility and the tiny little bit of auto attack damage that you would get out of Eternal Skirmish. And it certainly is better than trying to pick up the 20 armor or whatever that you would get out of, I don't even remember the name of it, the tank one. Don't use it. On Cloak, Leech is the best enchant, Leech and Stamina. The Leech healing will add up over the course of a dungeon. It's not great, but it is better than Speed, because you don't really need the speed to be able to kite successfully. It's not going to impact your gameplay one way or the other. And avoidance damage you take in Mythic Plus, unlike in raids, is very rarely AoE. It's usually, at least the dangerous damage is usually single target focused on you, and the Leech is going to have much more of an impact in healing you back up. For rings, versatility. And then for boots, you run agility. Pretty easy choices all there. Now let's talk about trinkets, and there is a really good trifecta that I will strongly encourage you to pick up. By far the best defensive trinket in the game for monks is Shard of Anhilda's Aegis. This trinket from the 9 in Sanctum of Domination is still the best defensive trinket, by far. I can't reiterate that enough. It's pretty stupid that it is the best. It's a season old. It provides flat damage reduction after all other damage reduction effects are calculated, so armor, stagger, versatility, all come into play. Then, after all of that, whatever the final damage value would be, 5,000 or whatever, this trinket then comes in and reduces, I think on Mythic it's 9,000-ish from that final amount. So in a lot of cases, it'll just zero out your damage taken. It also applies to each stagger tick you take while it's active, which is crazy. I mean, it basically makes you immune to damage while it's up. It's so strong defensively. The cooldown is only 90 seconds too. It's almost impossible to die while this is active. The better of the other two options is Codex of the First Technique, which kind of functions like a proc version of Anhilda's Aegis, although at a much lower value of flat damage reduction, and it also comes with a base of stamina instead of agility. It's still a really good trinket. It will reflect a lot of damage over the course of a dungeon. It's much better offensively than Anhilda's Aegis is. But be warned that it will deal damage to literally whatever you're targeting if you take damage from stagger while it's active and you're in line of sight. I will say, I tried to use it to pull stuff from opposite or, adjacent rooms while I was in the maze in Mists of Tir Naseath, and unfortunately that does not work, but I have accidentally, in the course of finishing a pull and hitting Expel Harm, targeted a random mob 70 yards away in Necrotic Wake and wiped the group by pulling in 3 extra packs. Whoopsie. Because of that, I recommend that you make a macro for this trinket if you're going to wear it that has the line /cancel aura first technique. That is the name of the buff, and whenever you finish combat, whenever you're about to leave combat, I would say it's a good idea to get in the habit of just sort of smacking that macro, just to make sure that you're not accidentally pulling in, 2 or 3 extra packs that you were trying to skip, and instead you wipe your run and brick the key that was going to be your first 20 Necrotic Wake of the season, just hypothetically speaking. The third trinket of this trifecta is still Blood Spattered Scale from the other side. It's a great defensive trinket. It does a nice chunk of damage to all nearby enemies, so it's a really good choice for just putting out a little bit of extra threat at the start of pulls, just to make sure you've really got threat totally locked down. It's also good as a reactive, oh, my health is low, or, I'm about to take a huge hit kind of skill too. The only other trinket that's really worth mentioning is Reactive Defensive Matrix from Sanctum of Domination. Again, another old trinket that's still pretty good. It will add up to a decent amount of damage over the course of a run. It's a good trinket, but it doesn't have, the same level of incredible defensive scaling as Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, or the same level of on-demand value that you would get out of Blood Spattered Scale. It doesn't have the annoying stagger pull interaction that Codex of the First Technique does, which is nice, but it is just ultimately a weaker trinket than any of the other 3. As for pushing Mythic Plus, you can use a Cheat Death trinket, but I generally think they are just a much weaker choice than running more proactive defensive trinkets. A Cheat Death is basically, it's not just a preemptive admission of failure, it's also a cooldown every 8 minutes, whereas a trinket like Shard or Scale is a cooldown every 90 seconds or 2 minutes. And they provide a lot more protection overall than a Cheat Death trinket. So I just generally think they're much better choices in every situation in Mythic Plus. Honestly, I would recommend a DPS trinket like Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall over a Cheat Death trinket, because I think you'll get more value out of it. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about anything, ask away. I have really had a lot of fun running dungeons this season, and I thought about doing some talk-through videos about the routes that I use for getting through each dungeon, and doing more Mythic Plus focus guides for each of the tanks as well. I'm just sort of curious what you guys would like to see, so let me know. I'm really glad that raid progression is finally done, so I can get back to making videos about WoW. Help me figure out the right order to do them in, and that's what I'll do. I am also extremely excited for Season 4. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of this stuff roll out onto the PTR. The possibility of getting to do WoD Mythic Plus dungeons has me very excited. This is something I've been asking for since the Mythic Dungeon concept was even first floated in Legion. Love the idea of WoD and mop ones in the next expansion. Ho baby! Well, anyway, thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and bye.